hands were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze first. His bare fingers were numb, although they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and face were already freezing, while the skin of all his body became cold as it lost its blood. So let's talk this through. The blood was alive. That's a metaphor. Like the dog, so we got a simile. The dog wants to seek cover, wants to wrap itself up and bury itself in snow. Your blood, when you're getting hypothermia, does the same thing. It's actually a pretty good description of what happens with hypothermia. It turns out that your body sacrifices appendages first because they're the hardest to keep warm, and so the blood stops flowing into your hands and feet, and they freeze solid. But it keeps the blood in the core because that's what keeps your heart pumping and your body alive. And this is a pretty good description of that in sort of a metaphorical way. Anyway, but he was safe. Toes and nose and face would only be touched by the frost because the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with sticks the size of his finger. In another minute, he would be able to feed it with larger branches. Then he could remove his wet moccasins and socks. While they dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them first with snow. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old man on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The man had been very serious when he said that no man should travel alone in that country after 50 below zero. Well, here he was. He had had the accident, he was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old men were rather womanish, he thought. All a man must do to keep his head was to keep his head, and he would be all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone. Pause. All right, so again, we're getting the hubris, we're getting the arrogance. I think it's clear at this point that the man, the protagonist, is facing cold and nature as the antagonist. If you haven't seen that already and you haven't put that down, who's the antagonist of the story? It's the cold. It's nature. There's nothing else that's opposed to him. That's his greatest enemy. So it's a man versus nature story, like in terms of your buzzword theme, civilization versus nature. That doesn't cover it, but that's sort of the category that it falls into. Also, any man who was a man could travel alone. Again, the arrogance, but more evidence that maybe he's symbolic of humanity in general and humanity's attitude towards nature, its dismissive attitude towards nature. Anyway, but it was surprising, the rapidity with which his face and nose was freezing, and he had not thought his fingers could lose their feeling in so short a time. Without feeling, they were, because he found it very difficult to make them move together to grasp a stick. They seemed far from his body and from him. When he touched a stick, he had to look to see whether or not he was holding it, so his senses are getting confused. We have the sense of touch, but his hands are so numb, they still move, but he can't feel anything. The outer surface of his hands is frozen solid. All of which mattered little. There was a fire, promising life with every dancing flame, personification. He started to untie his moccasins. They were coated with ice. The thick socks were like iron, almost to his knees. The moccasin strings were like ropes of steel. For a moment he pulled them with his unfeeling fingers. Then he realized the foolishness of it. He grasped his knife. All right, a couple of things here. These are similes, like iron and like ropes of steel. But clearly London is doing something with them here. Why pick iron? Why pick steel? Because they're imprisoning metaphors. The ice is imprisoning. It's binding. They're also cold. These are cold metals, and we want you to have a cold image that the ice is binding and freezing and locking him up sort of in some way. So I think that's interesting. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. Oh, hey, another transition. It happened. What is it? What happened? It was his own fault, or instead his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the pine tree. He should have built it in an open space, but it had been easier to pull the sticks from the bushes and drop them directly on the fire. Now the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its branches. No wind had been blowing for weeks, and each branch was heavy with snow. Each time he pulled a stick, he shook the tree slightly. There had been just enough movement to cause the awful thing to happen. High up in the tree, one branch dropped its load of snow, then fell on the branches beneath. This process continued, spreading through the whole tree. The snow fell without warning upon the man and the fire was dead. Hey, we took a long time to personify the fire as alive, now we can call it dead. It's a good word choice. It's also maybe foreshadowing. Where it had burned was a pile of fresh snow. The man was shocked. It was like he was hearing his own judgment of death. Simile, For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew very calm. Perhaps the old man on Sulphur Creek was right. Interesting choice. Again, we just had death, now we got Sulphur Creek. Is that more evidence that maybe this is a hell illusion? I don't know. If he had a companion on the trail, he would be in no danger now. The companion could have built the fire. Now he must build the fire again, and the second time he must not fail. Even if he succeeded, he would be likely to lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now, and there would be some time before the second fire was ready. Such were his thoughts, but he did not sit and think them. He was very busy the whole time they were passing through his mind. He made a new foundation for a fire, this time in an open space where no trees would be above it. Next, he gathered dry grass and tiny sticks. He could not bring his fingers together to pull them out of the ground, but he was able to gather them by the handful. In this way, he also got many pieces that were undesirable, but it was the best he could do. He worked carefully, even collecting an armful of the larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while, the dog sat and watched him. There was an anxious look in his eyes because it depended on him as a fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. This is the rising action. You can really feel the increase in intensity as these things happen. A series of events. He soaks himself. He starts the fire goes out. He's trying to build a second one, but the cold is so great. We've got the dog watching. All of these are designed to ratchet up the tension. When all was ready, the man reached in his pocket for the second piece of tree bark. He knew the bark was there, although he could not feel it with his fingers. He tried again and again, but he could not grasp it. And all the time in his mind, he knew that each instant his feet were freezing. This thought alarmed him, but he fought against it and kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth and began swinging his arms. Then he beat his hands with all his strength against his sides. He did this while he was sitting down. Then he stood up to do it. All the while, the dog sat in the snow, with its tail curled warmly over its feet and its sharp wolf ears bent forward as it looked at the man. And the man, as he waved his arms and hands, looked with longing at the creature that was warm and secure in the covering provided by nature. Again, juxtaposition. Here's a dog, safe and warm because it's part of nature, and the human who has none of this natural ability to stay warm, doing what he can to build a fire, a trick of civilization to keep himself warm and alive. After a time, he began to notice some feeling in his beaten fingers. The feeling grew stronger until it became very painful, but the man welcomed the pain. He pulled the mitten from his right hand and grasped the tree bark from his pocket. The bare fingers were quickly numb again. Next, he brought out his pack of matches, but the awful cold had already driven the life out of his fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole pack fell in the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow, but failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor hold. Now he was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and face from his mind. He devoted his whole soul to picking up the matches. That's hyperbole. That's the first time we mentioned soul, too. We went out of our way at the beginning to say that the guy had no concerns about heaven or hell or his soul or death or any of that. But now he's devoting his whole soul to picking up the matches. He followed the movement of his fingers with his eyes, using his sense of sight instead of that of touch. When he saw his fingers on each side of the pack, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them because the fingers did not obey. He put the mitten on the right hand again and beat it fiercely against his knee. Then, with both mittened hands, he lifted up the pack of matches, along with much snow, to the front of his jacket. But he had gained nothing. After some struggling, he managed to get the pack between his mittened hands. In this manner, he carried it to his mouth. The ice broke as he opened his mouth with a fierce effort. He used his upper teeth to rub across the pack in order to separate a single match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped on his jacket. His condition was no better. He could not pick up the match. Then he thought how he might do it. He picked up the match in his teeth and drew it across his legs. 20 times he did this before he succeeded in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the tree bark, but the burning smell went up his nose, causing him to cough. The match fell into the snow, and the flame died. The old man on Sulphur Creek was right, he thought in the moment of controlled despair that followed. After 50 below zero, a man should travel with a companion. He beat his hands but failed to produce any feeling in them. Suddenly he bared both hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole pack of matches between his hands. His arm muscles were not frozen, and he was able to press the hands tightly against the matches. Then he drew the whole pack along his leg. It burst into flame, 70 matches at once. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the burning smell and held the flaming pack to the tree bark. As he so held it, he noticed some feeling in his hand. His flesh was burning. He could smell it. The feeling developed into pain. He continued to endure it. He held the flame of the matches to the bark that would not light readily because his own burning hands were taking most of the flame. It's a pretty horrible image. The fire that he's trying to start burning his body so frozen that he can barely feel it. Finally, when he could endure no more, he pulled his hands apart. The flaming matches fell into the snow, but the tree bark was burning. He began laying dry grasses and the tiniest sticks on the flames. He could not choose carefully, because they must be pieces that could be lifted between his hands. Small pieces of green grass stayed on the sticks, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He treated the flame carefully. It meant life, more symbolic flame language there. And it must not cease. The blood had left the surface of his body, and he now began to shake from the cold. A large piece of wet plant fell on the little fire. He tried to push it out with his fingers. His shaking body made him push it too far, and he scattered the little fire over a wide space. He tried to push the burning grasses and sticks together again. Even with the strong effort that he made, his trembling fingers would not obey, and the sticks were hopelessly scattered. Each stick smoked a little and died. There's that word died again. Also, the fire, he wants it to obey him. He's usually in control of it, but the more cold he gets, the less control he has of nature, of his own body, those sorts of things. The fire provider had failed. Yeah. As he looked about him, his eyes noticed the dog sitting across the ruins of the fire from him. It was making uneasy movements, slightly lifting one foot and then the other. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the story of a man caught in a storm who killed an animal and sheltered himself inside the dead body and thus was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the feeling returned to them. Then he could build another fire. All right, we're already starting to get a sense of how foolish this is. He's going to kill the dog and bury his hands in there and start another fire with what matches? He just used them all, but he's not even thinking about that anymore. He spoke to the dog, calling to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal. It had never known the man to speak in such a tone before. Again, the dog is smarter than the man, right? Something was wrong, and it sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere in its brain arose a fear of the man. It flattened its ears at the sound of the man's voice. Its uneasy movements and the liftings of its feet became more noticeable, but it would not come to the man. He got down on his hands and knees and went toward the dog, but this unusual position again excited fear, and the animal moved away. The man sat in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens using his teeth, and then stood on his feet. He glanced down to assure himself that he was really standing, because the lack of feeling in his feet gave him no relation to the earth. This is the start of a new sort of thematic idea. Maybe not new, but no relation of feeling to the earth. It's like he's separating slowly from the earth, and we're going to see this repeated as the story continues. His position, however, removed the fear from the dog's mind. When he commanded the dog with his usual voice, the dog obeyed and came to him. As it came within reach, the man lost control. His arms stretched out to hold the dog, and he experienced real surprise when he discovered that his hands could not grasp. There was neither bend nor feeling in the fingers. He had forgotten for the moment that they were frozen and that they were freezing more and more. And all this happened quickly, and before the animal could escape, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow and in this fashion held the dog while it barked and struggled. But it was all he could do. Hold its body encircled in his arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his frozen hands, he could neither draw nor hold his knife, nor could he grasp the dog around the throat. He freed it, and it dashed wildly away, still barking. It stopped 40 feet away and observed him curiously, with ears sharply bent forward. Pause. Now, is that the climax? You could argue that. You could argue that it comes later. I think there's room for argument. The climax in this story is not, some really strong thing. The rising action is very strong, and the climax is, you could argue this ends the events that were going on. I think you could argue at a later point we have a climax as well. So if you pick this one, I think you're fine. But if you picked one later, I think you're fine too. I think you could make the argument either way. Not all stories, slavishly follow the model. The model is just a way of understanding stories, the way they format the story itself. Anyway, does the knife represent civilization? Is this a symbolic encounter? I think it is. The man in his civilized way trying to murder the dog may be representative of nature, incapable of doing it because of the cold. The man looked down at his hands to locate them.